There have been countless serial killers throughout history. Since the year 1900, there have been over 3,600 serial killers in the US alone. While some of these, like Ted Bundy and Charles Manson, are household names, there are plenty of brutal and horrific criminals that you haven't even heard of, and today we're going to be looking at 50 of them. Gilles de Rais, also known as the Baron de Rais, was a knight and lord living in France in the 1400s. Now, for those who have heard of him, he may best be known as a leader in the French army who fought alongside Joan of Arc during the 100 Years' War. However, in 1432, Gilles' grandfather and guardian died, and the following year his cousin, the Grand Chamberlain of France, was disgraced. Gilles was then disgraced by King Charles VII and withdrew from the military, instead pursuing his own personal interests, and those interests included alchemy, demon summoning, and other forms of heresy. For the remainder of that decade, Gilles' name became infamous as reports of missing children started piling up in the immediate vicinity of his homes. There were talks of children who would go to his castle to beg for food, only to never be seen or heard from again. It was believed that he was murdering the children and using their blood to perform black magic. After authorities conducted a secret investigation, Gilles was arrested in 1440 and tried in both the secular and ecclesiastical courts. Gilles gave a full confession, though had he not confessed, he would have been tortured until he confessed anyway. The ecclesiastical court convicted him of the sexual assault and murder of 140 or more children, as well as of heresy. The secular court also convicted him of an act of rebellion, as well as crimes against several small children, though they did not give a specific number. Although the number of child murders he actually committed is difficult to say, historians generally agree that he was guilty of several murders. Gilles de Rais is sometimes referred to as the first serial killer in recorded history, though there are other contenders depending on how the term is defined. Today's episode is brought to you by the fine people over at Sheath Underwear. Let's be real about it, your underwear situation, it could be better. Look, whatever you're dealing with, chafing, overheating, adjustment dances, sorting out the wedgie in public, it's never a good look. It's time to upgrade your underwear to Sheath. Sheath's got a dual pouch design, so it's not just underwear, it's engineering for your anatomy. It keeps everything separated, cool, exactly where it's supposed to be. There's no more awkward shifting. It's just comfortable, it's breathable. You'll buy one and then the next thing you know, your underwear drawer will be filled with it. I'm wearing it right now, I'm holding it in my hand right now. It's really just excellent underwear, simple as that. Plus, they've got a whole bunch of other stuff, winter base layers, hoodies, perfect for staying warm during workouts, outdoor adventures, whatever you're up to. Do it comfortably. So go to sheath.com/sideprojects and use the code SIDEPROJECTS for 20% off your order. You will never go back. Your drawer will eventually be full of it. And that's Sheath Underwear. Thank you to them for sponsoring. And now back to the episode. Vlado Taneski was born in 1952 in the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, in the area that is now Macedonia. Much of his life was quite normal, with Vlado attending school in Croatia to study journalism, getting married, and getting a job at a radio station, and then as a newspaper reporter. He enjoyed his work as a journalist for 2 decades, until everything went wrong all at once. In 2002, Vlado's father killed himself. A few months later, his mother accidentally overdosed and died. The following year, Vlado was laid off from his job at the paper, and then his wife, a lawyer, got a promotion that resulted in her leaving him and moving to the capital city of Skopje. With his life seemingly falling apart, all Vlado could do was attempt to find work as a freelance journalist. Though not the most prolific of killers, what made Vlado so horrible was the way that he committed his crimes. From the end of 2004 until 2008, Vlado kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 3 women. His mother had worked as a cleaner, and every one of his victims was a cleaner who had worked with his mother. Immediately after each murder, Vlado would write a news article about his own crime that he hoped to sell to local newspapers. He fell under suspicion of the police when one of his articles included details that had not been released to the public, and he was arrested after semen found in the victims was matched to his DNA. Vlado was arrested in June of 2008 and was found dead in his cell the next day, having ended his own life. Yang Xinhai was the most prolific Chinese serial killer and one of the 10 most prolific of all time. Yang was born in 1968, and despite being regarded as highly intelligent, he dropped out of school at 17 to work as a day laborer. At the age of 20, He was convicted of theft and sent to China's labor camps for 3 years. 5 years after his release, he was convicted of sexual assault and sentenced to 5 years in prison, though he was released in 1999 after 3 years. For the 4 years that followed, Yang would travel throughout China, murdering entire families. He would sneak into a house at night, usually a farmhouse, and kill everyone inside with an axe, a hammer, or a shovel. Basically, it was whatever weapon was most readily available in each house. Yang would also sexually assault a number of his female victims before they died. The media dubbed him the Monster Killer, and Yang was wanted for murder in 4 provinces. He was caught in November 2003 when police thought he was acting suspiciously during a routine interaction. He was brought in for questioning, at which point they discovered that he was wanted for murder. 3 months later, Yang was convicted on 67 counts of murder and 23 counts of sexual assault. He was executed 2 weeks after his conviction. Kermit Gosnell was a doctor from Philadelphia. He was born in 1941 and he got his medical degree in 1966. From there, he began working with the poor and advocating for abortion rights. However, his specialty was illegal late-term abortions. In 1972, the Philadelphia Inquirer published that Gosnell was a respected man in the community, but that would change later that year with what became known as the Mother's Day Massacre of 1972. Gosnell televised the second trimester abortions of 15 patients using an experimental and untested device known as the supercoil. Developed by Harvey Carbon, the supercoil was supposed to be a simple device that a layperson could use for late-term abortions with little to no training. He claimed it would irritate the uterus and cause it to expel the fetus. In reality, it was a plastic ball full of razor blades that was designed to chop up the fetus so that it would be expelled. It also caused life-threatening injuries to the woman. But Gosnell's attempts at late-term abortions didn't end with this disaster. He continued performing abortions into the 3rd trimester for decades. According to his staff, hundreds of these abortion attempts resulted in live births, with the infants being murdered by Gosnell afterwards. Although he was only convicted on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of involuntary manslaughter for a mother who died during a procedure, he is recognized as murdering at least 48 infants, possibly well into the hundreds. Gosnell is currently serving 3 consecutive life sentences. Gary Heidnik was another serial killer from Philadelphia, active at the same time as Gosnell. He's also known as one of the inspirations for Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. So this is going to be nice. Over the course of just 4 months, Gary kidnapped 6 different women who he tortured, sexually assaulted, and in 2 cases murdered. Allegedly, his goal was to keep 10 women captive, all of whom he would impregnate. Gary dug a pit in his basement where he would keep the women chained up. One of his victims, 24-year-old Sandra Lindsay, died as a result of torture, starvation, and fever. Gary dismembered her, cooked her ribs in the stove, and boiled her head in a pot. When police responded to calls about the smell coming from his house, Gary said that he fell asleep while cooking a roast, and the officers left. There's no evidence that any cannibalism took place, though Gary did try to start that rumor himself, presumably to bolster an insanity defense. His other victim who died was 23-year-old Deborah Dudley. He ordered another captive to fill the pit with water, then applied an exposed wire to Deborah's chains, electrocuting her to death. Gary was finally caught the day after taking his 6th victim, when he allowed her to go and see her family. He drove to a gas station and said that he would wait there for her to return, but instead of returning, she called the police. Obviously. Gary became the last person executed by the state of Pennsylvania. Good. Following the conviction of Ronald Dominique in 2008, the FBI stated that Ronald was the most significant serial killer in the United States in the previous 2 decades, both in terms of the number of victims and for how long he was active. However, the case was rarely reported on outside of Louisiana. Ronald grew up poor and dropped out of college, resulting in him working low-paying jobs. He also struggled to hold down any one job for an extended period of time due to behavior issues, so he mostly survived by leeching off his relatives. In 1996, at the age of 32, Ronald was living with his sister. One night, a young man jumped out of the window of Ronald's bedroom, then ran to a neighbor's house to tell them that Ronald had attempted to sexually assault and murder him. This resulted in an arrest and a few months in prison, since Ronald could not afford the $100,000 bail, but there was never a trial. The victim vanished, and prosecutors were unable to track him down, and so the case fell apart. In the decade that followed, at least 23 men ranging in age from 16 to 46 would be sexually assaulted and murdered by Ronald, who became known as the Bayou Strangler. Most of his victims were met at gay bars, and he would lure them back to his place with promises of drugs, booze, and threesomes with his non-existent girlfriend. These encounters would begin with the victim being tied up under the guise of Ronald's girlfriends being into bondage. If the person refused to be tied up, they would be let go, which is ultimately how he got caught. One potential victim who refused to be tied up wound up going to the police later. This led to the police bringing Ronald in to get a DNA sample, which ultimately led to his arrest and conviction. He was convicted of 23 murders and sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences, though his real victim count could be much higher. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, better known as Pedrino Matador or Killer Petey, was a serial killer from Brazil and another of the 10 most prolific killers of all time. Pedro came from an abusive household, and his father was so violent that he actually sustained brain damage while still in the womb as a result of his father hitting his mother. Pedro was violent at a young age, and at the age of 13 he tried to murder his cousin by forcing him through a sugarcane press. The following year, Pedro murdered the deputy mayor in front of City Hall for firing his father. He then went on the run and began dating and working for a gang leader. Pedro spent the next 6 years murdering their enemies and got his boss pregnant, though she was murdered by a rival gang before he had a child. When he was 19, Pedro was arrested and sent to prison for murder, but he didn't stop there. Once behind bars, he killed 47 more people, including his father, who had been arrested for murdering his mother. Between his initial gang activity and the murders behind bars, Pedro was convicted of 71 murders in total, though he is believed to have killed well over 100. But the maximum sentence under Brazilian law at the time was 30 years, so Pedro was released from prison and became a YouTuber until he was murdered in 2023. Oh no! Alexander Pichushkin was born in Soviet Russia in the 1970s. He was a normal child until the age of 4, when he experienced an unfortunate accident. Alexander went too high on a swing and fell backwards to the ground. He was fine, so he stood up, only to then be hit in the forehead by the swing as it came back down. This caused brain damage in the frontal lobe, resulting in a shift from being a happy and sociable child to being violent and impulsive. The accident caused a learning disability as well, which resulted in Alexander being bullied throughout his entire childhood. He committed his first murder at the age of 18, killing a friend who was originally supposed to be his murder accomplice. After a 9-year hiatus, he began killing again, dumping people in the sewers beneath Bitsa Park in Moscow. Inspired by the news reporting surrounding Andrei Chikatilo, a Russian serial killer who is much more well-known globally, Alexander wanted to become Russia's most prolific murderer by beating Chikatilo's record of 52 confirmed victims. Over the case of 4 years, he'd go on to murder at least 49 people in Bitsa Park, often men in the park who he played chess with, or people who lived in his apartment building. Before he was captured, Alexander was known as the Maniac of Bitsa Park, named after an old urban legend, but after he was arrested, he became known as the Chessboard Killer. He used a chessboard to track his victim count, trying to fill all 64 squares, though he was arrested after only filling in 62, one of whom he later discovered had survived. After being arrested and sentenced to life in prison on 49 counts of murder, Alexander asked the judge if he could have credit for the other victims as well. The judge declined. Despite Chikatilo and Pichushkin's attempts to be the most prolific Russian serial killer of all time, that distinction actually goes to Olga Konstantinovna Briskorn of the Russian Empire in the 1800s. Olga was the daughter of a wealthy landowner and was married off to the wealthiest man in the Russian province. Her husband died when she was 39 and she moved to St. Petersburg. A year later she married and she purchased an estate in Kursk on which she built a factory. Hundreds of serfs were brought in to both build the factory and tend to Olga's land. Her serfs worked 15-hour days, and those working in the factory also had to sleep on the factory floor. Those who tended Olga's fields were worked to the point that they had no time to tend to their own crops, resulting in their starvation. Between the starvation and the constant physical abuse in the form of beatings and whippings, 128 of her serfs died, with hundreds more fleeing her land entirely. Those that fled appealed to Emperor Alexander I to investigate the abnormally high mortality rate on Olga's property. After a 3-year investigation conducted in secret, Olga was convicted of 128 murders and imprisoned for the rest of her life. Joe Metheny was born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1955. Although his father was an alcoholic who died when he was 6, Joe had a loving and hard-working mother who worked multiple jobs to provide for her children. After high school, Joe joined the army and was stationed in Germany. He claimed to have served in Vietnam as well, though there doesn't appear to be any evidence of this. Whether it was true or not, Vietnam was the story that Joe told to explain how he got addicted to heroin. Despite having a steady job as a forklift driver, where his co-workers described him as polite and intelligent, Joe was harmless. All the money went to heroin, cocaine, and alcohol. As far as can be proven, he began murdering people in 1994. He mostly targeted drug-addicted sex workers, though he also murdered 2 other homeless men during an altercation in the tent city where he was staying beneath Baltimore's Hanover Street Bridge. In December 1996, Joe attempted to sexually assault and murder a woman after they had done drugs together. She managed to escape and went to the police. Joe, on the other hand, went straight to one of his friends to ask for help in burying the body of a victim that he had killed a couple of weeks earlier. That friend also went to the police. Although he claimed to have killed 13 people, Joe was only convicted of 2 murders. After his conviction, evidence was found to confirm 3 more murders. He was initially sentenced to life in prison for 1 murder and to death for the other, though the death penalty was overturned and reduced to a second sentence of life in prison. Edward Edwards was on the wrong side of the law pretty much for his entire life. He was an orphan, and he joined the US Marines as soon as he turned 18, but he then went AWOL and was dishonorably discharged. Edward worked a number of odd jobs, but by 1955, he had already found himself in jail for petty crimes. He escaped from that jail, then spent the next few years traveling the country and robbing gas stations. Edward never wore a disguise when committing crimes because he wanted to be famous. In 1960, he was arrested again in Oregon, but he again escaped from jail and wound up on the FBI's most wanted list. In 1962, he was finally captured and imprisoned for 5 years, after which time he became a motivational speaker. Because of course he did. But he hadn't actually turned a corner in his life. Things were only going to get worse. While traveling the country as a motivational speaker, he committed at least 4 murders, 2 sets of double murders. He killed a 19-year-old couple in Wisconsin, which became known as the Sweetheart Murders. It wasn't until 29 years later, when he was watching a documentary about the Sweetheart Murders with his daughter, that he would get caught. His daughter April found the way that Edward talked about the murders to be suspicious, and she believed that he could be involved. April tipped off the police that her father might have been responsible, and this was confirmed through DNA testing. She got snitched on by his own daughter. Edward was convicted of 5 murders in total, the 2 sets of double murders, and the murder of his foster son. He received 4 life sentences and 1 death sentence, though he died of natural causes just a few months before he was set to be executed. Despite the 5 convictions, it's believed he killed anywhere from 9 to 15 people, possibly many more. According to April, and based on her father's reactions to documentaries about the topic, she was absolutely convinced that Edward was the Zodiac Killer. John Crutchley, known as the Vampire Rapist, has never been proven of being a serial killer, though it is suspected that he killed as many as 30 or more women. It began in 1985, when 19-year-old Laura Murphy was found naked and handcuffed crawling along the side of the road. A man picked her up, and she begged not to be taken back to that house. He made a note of which house she meant, took the girl back to her home, and then called 911. Laura had been repeatedly sexually assaulted and drained of nearly half her blood, which she said John had extracted from her with syringes and drank, claiming to be a vampire. An initial search of John's home revealed all sorts of disturbing evidence, such as a massive stack of credit cards, a collection of women's necklaces, and several locks of hair. These items were noted by the police, but not actually collected at the time. By the time a second, more thorough search was conducted, all of those items were gone. John was convicted of kidnapping and sexual assault and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. He only served 11 and was released in 1996. However, less than a day after he was released, he was caught smoking marijuana. Kidnapping and sexual assault were strikes 1 and 2, which meant that smoking weed was strike 3. He received a mandatory life sentence under Florida's 3 strikes law. First time I'm really liking that law. A few years later, he was found dead in his cell from autoerotic asphyxiation, so the true extent of his crimes was never discovered. Karl Denke, also known as the Forgotten Cannibal, was born to a family of German farmers in the Kingdom of Prussia in 1860, in an area that is now Poland. When Karl was 25, he inherited land and money after his father's death, and he tried to make it as a farmer. This did not work, so he sold his land and instead bought a house that he could rent the rooms out of. This also didn't last long due to inflation, so he sold the house, got a small apartment, and became a shopkeeper selling leather goods and meat. He was well respected in the community and was known for his charitable nature, but in 1903, he began murdering vagrants and poor travelers. It's not known why he began killing, but if Sweeney Todd has taught us nothing else, it's that murder is a great way to acquire raw goods for free. In December of 1921, a townswoman sent a homeless vagrant named Vincennes to Karl's house on account of his charitable nature. Karl offered Vincennes 20 pfennig to write down a note for him while he dictated, which he accepted. When Karl dictated, "Adolf, you fat slob," the confused Vincennes turned around just in time to dodge the pickaxe that was coming down on his head. He escaped the house and called for help. But Karl was such a nice guy, and Vincennes was just a homeless bum, so he was arrested for vagrancy and panhandling. A judge insisted that they look into the claims that Vincennes had made, though, so Karl was placed in a holding cell while they searched his house. As soon as he was alone, he hung himself. Inside Karl's home, they found a notebook containing 31 victims' names, the last of which was Vincennes, confirming that he had killed at least 30 people. However, the house was also full of leather products that were discovered to have been made from human skin, and barrels of brine containing nondescript meat believed to be human. And there were also human bones everywhere. Based on the number of body parts found, authorities believed that Karl had murdered at least 42 people and that had been selling their meat as pickled pork. Jose Durango Vargas Gomez was born into a poor farming family in Venezuela in 1957. By the time he was in his 30s, Durango was homeless and he was arrested a couple more times for stealing livestock. Then, in 1995, he was arrested for a third time for murdering someone and eating their body. Durango, now known as El Comgente, or the People Eater, was sent to a psychiatric rehabilitation center. They thought he was a pretty normal guy, though. Everything seemed fine, so they let him go. But everything was not fine, at least not as long as Durango was going to remain homeless and squatting in a shack in the woods. Between November of 1998 and January of 1999, he began murdering people for food. His victims were all adult men who were in good shape. Durango would cut up their bodies, bury the parts that he couldn't eat, like hands and feet, and then bring the rest back to his shack to prepare. But because he didn't have a refrigerator or freezer to keep the meat from spoiling, he would have to routinely kill people in order to get more food. In that 3-month span, Durango is known to have committed 14 murders, though he is suspected of many more. He has been in prison ever since, and in a 2016 prison riot, he murdered 2 inmates and fed them to other inmates. At least, he understood the importance of sharing, we suppose. Denis Pischikov was born in Soviet Russia in 1983. He came from a good and loving family until the fall of the Soviet Union. Once the USSR fell, it was difficult to find work. His father was left unemployed and died shortly after. His mother worked and remarried, but her new husband was an alcoholic who neglected Denis. After only completing the 5th grade, Denis dropped out of school. He was constantly getting arrested for theft and hooliganism, but he generally got off light because he came across as such a nice boy. In 2000, he moved to Moscow and was again arrested for theft. Again, he was let off easy, but told not to leave Moscow. Denis immediately left and moved to the Vladimir region of Russia. Once he was there, he met a nice girl, fell in love, and the two moved in together. Now, at first, Denis was working to help pull his weight, but after a couple of years, he decided to stop working. He began lying to his girlfriend, saying that he was going to work, and he would instead break into the homes of elderly people, murder them, and rob their houses of money and food. He would then bring that money home and claim that it was his pay for the day. He soon became known as the Shivering Creature, and he murdered 13 people. On his final attempt, he tried to murder an elderly man and his 50-year-old daughter, but the daughter survived and went to the police. Denis was quickly arrested afterward when he was spotted walking through the streets looking for his next house to rob. After being arrested, Denis confessed to everything, seemingly unaware of the trouble he was in. According to the investigators, he did not even understand what else they wanted from him except his cooperation with the investigation. Denis was convicted of 14 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Jack Unterweger was born in Austria in 1950, the son of a Viennese waitress and an American soldier. His father was never in the picture, and his mother was arrested when Jack was only 3, so he was sent to live with his grandfather. Together, Jack and his grandfather would steal livestock. Growing up, Jack was in and out of prison. Between the ages of 16 and 24, he was convicted 16 times, usually for theft, but also for sexual assault and pimping. Then, when he was 24, Jack committed his first murder. He killed an 18-year-old West German woman by strangling her to death with her bra. He was convicted of murder and sent to prison. While behind bars, Jack began writing poetry, short stories, stage plays, children's books, and an autobiography titled Purgatory or the Trip to Prison, Report of a Guilty Man. His work was good, and it began catching the attention of Austrian intellectuals. Suddenly, it seemed that all the writers, artists, and journalists of Austria, as well as some politicians, were advocating for Jack to be pardoned. Now, this didn't happen, and he was forced to serve the mandatory 15-year portion of his sentence. After 15 years, he was released, and he became a bit of a celebrity. Purgatory was taught in schools, and his children's books were read aloud over the radio. Jack got a job as a journalist, and just like with Vlado earlier, he began reporting on murders that it later turned out that he had committed himself. His status as a celebrity journalist afforded him the opportunity to travel and report on crimes in other countries, which also saw Jack commit murders in West Germany, Czechoslovakia, and the United States. All of the victims were strangled to death with their bras, just like Jack's first victim, but it took a shocking amount of time for anyone to make that connection. He claimed at least 11 more victims before being arrested, possibly as many as 15. He was convicted of 9 murders and sentenced to life without parole. Jack made his desire to appeal the conviction known, then that night hung himself in his jail cell. Because he had intended to seek an appeal, under Austrian law, his death meant that the conviction was not legally binding, so theoretically, he is only an alleged serial killer. Randy Kraft, out of California, became known as the Scorecard Killer because, upon his arrest, police discovered a scorecard containing cryptic entries about 61 victims. But before his capture, he was known as the Freeway Killer, as most of his victims' bodies were found along the California freeway. Randy's victims were all males between the ages of 13 and 35, usually in their late teens or early 20s. He would lure his victims into his car, either by offering them alcohol or a ride somewhere. He would then give them drinks laced with tranquilizers to subdue the victims. Once the victims had passed out from the mix of alcohol and narcotics, Randy would bind, torture, and sexually assault them before eventually killing them. Usually his method of killing was strangulation, though he would sometimes bludgeon them to death as well. This began in 1971 and continued until 1983, until Randy was pulled over for a suspected DUI. He exited his vehicle while pouring a beer can on the pavement and walked to the police car. A field sobriety test was administered, which he failed, and so he was arrested. While this was going on, another officer checked Randy's car. There were empty beer bottles, open bottles of prescription drugs, and another man who was bound and appeared to be unconscious. On further inspection, the man was already dead. However, despite the person not having any open wounds, the passenger seat was covered in bloodstains. This made it clear to police that this wasn't Randy's first victim. Randy was convicted of 16 counts of murder and sentenced to death. 35 years later, he is still sitting on death row and proclaiming his innocence despite being caught red-handed. In addition to the 16 murders of which he was convicted, it is believed there were 51 other victims as well. Herbert Mullin often gets overlooked because he was operating in the same place and at the same time as Edmund Kemper, despite actually claiming more victims than Kemper did. He had a normal childhood and was even voted most likely to succeed in high school, but things changed when he was about 16 and started experiencing symptoms of mental illness. At 16, Herbert was admitted to a mental hospital for the first time, and he spent the next several years in and out of various mental hospitals. During this time, he received the diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, the condition that was made worse by his use of psychotropic drugs. In 1972, at the age of 25, Herbert moved back in with his parents and began a 4-month murder spree, allegedly instigated by his paranoid delusions. He was born on the anniversary of the 1906 San Francisco earthquake, and he claimed to believe that nature demanded American blood sacrifices to prevent future earthquakes. The Vietnam War had provided plenty of these sacrifices, but with the war winding down, Herbert claimed that he had to take matters into his own hands to prevent future earthquakes. It was difficult for police to tie his crimes together, both because of Kemper's victims being found at the same time, and because Herbert had no clear patterns. His victims and the method in which he murdered them were seemingly random. The only targeted victim was an old high school friend who had first introduced Herbert to marijuana because he believed that the drug use was responsible for all of the problems in his life. Herbert was finally caught after he randomly pulled the car over and shot a 72-year-old man in broad daylight in front of witnesses. He was quickly tracked down and arrested, and he confessed all of the murders. After a mental competency hearing, Herbert was found fit to stand trial and convicted of 2 first-degree murders and 9 second-degree murders. He was sentenced to life in prison. Linda Hazard, often referred to as the starvation doctor, was a conwoman and practitioner of alternative medicine. Due to a loophole in Washington state laws, Linda was able to receive a license to practice medicine despite having no medical degree or training. She built a sanitarium called Wilderness Heights, better known to locals as Starvation Heights because of the methods that Linda employed. Linda believed that fasting was a panacea that could cure all diseases, and even wrote 3 pseudoscientific books explaining the alleged science behind why this worked. Starvation was the main method employed by Linda at a sanitarium, with other treatments including beatings and enemas lasting hours. Though some of her patients survived and spoke very highly of the treatment, most of them died of starvation. Linda decided to use their deaths for her own financial gain, stealing their valuables and forging their wills. Linda was only caught after 2 wealthy British sisters, Claire and Dorothea Williamson, stayed at Wilderness Heights. They managed to sneak out a telegram to alert their governess in Australia that they needed help. By the time they arrived, Dorothea weighed only 60 pounds and was too weak to leave on her own, and Claire had already passed away, weighing only 50 pounds at the time of her death. Though she is now considered a serial killer, Linda was only charged with manslaughter for the deaths of 15 people and also with forgery. She was convicted and sentenced to 2 to 20 years hard labor, but after 2 years she was released and received a pardon from the governor of Washington because... okay. Juan Corona was born in Mexico in 1934, and at the age of 16 he traveled to California illegally to find work on local farms. Well, things went well at first, though at the age of 22 he had what was believed to be a schizophrenic episode, so he was committed to a mental hospital. There, he was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, though after 3 months and 23 rounds of electroshock therapy, he was declared to be cured. Juan was then released from the hospital and deported back to Mexico. 6 years later, Juan returned to California, this time legally. He was considered a good, hard worker who was also prone to violent schizophrenic episodes. In 1970, he was committed to the same mental hospital again, and he was again released after treatment. Despite his episodes, nobody really suspected anything too bad of Juan. Fruit farmers would hire him to staff their ranches, and everything just seemed to be going fine. Then, in May 1971, a farmer who was using Juan to staff his ranch noticed that a large hole had been dug in his peach orchard. The next day, the hole was filled, so the owner investigated and discovered a freshly murdered body had been buried there. Also in the hole were receipts with Juan's name, address, and signature on them. Juan was arrested, and both the ranch and his house were searched. In total, they found 25 victims buried in the peach orchard, all of them men between the ages of 47 and 64. They'd all been hired by Juan, and all but one of them had been stabbed with a knife or a machete. The final victim was shot. Juan had murdered 25 people in a span of only 3 months, and at the time he was considered the deadliest serial killer in American history. He was charged with 25 counts of first-degree murder and pled not guilty. His attorneys argued insanity, but Juan was convicted on all counts and sentenced to life in prison. Charles Suradji was born in Saigon, French Indonesia, what is now Vietnam. Because it was a French colony at the time, Charles was eligible for French citizenship and frequently traveled between France and Vietnam. He found himself on the wrong side of the law from an early age, taking part in petty crimes. Charles was in and out of prisons for much of his life, which caused him to get really good at manipulating guards. Thanks to a friendship he formed with a wealthy prison volunteer during his first stay in prison, Charles was able to bounce between Parisian high society and its criminal underworld, accumulating substantial wealth through a combination of burglaries and scams. He got married in 1970 at the age of 26, and he and his new wife, who was well aware of and also involved with his criminal activities, fled France to avoid being arrested. Charles and his wife began traveling Asia, preying on tourists who came to travel the hippie trail. He would gain people's trust by helping them solve problems he himself had created. In one instance, he provided shelter and comfort for a man who appeared to be suffering from dysentery, though the man had actually been poisoned by Charles. The first known murders began in 1975, usually through poisoning. Charles would argue that the victims had accidentally overdosed on heroin or benzodiazepine rather than being murdered. 2 female victims were drowned and then dressed in bikinis to make the deaths look like swimming accidents. This earned him the nickname the Bikini Killer. Charles was eventually convicted of murder in India and sentenced to 12 years in prison. When his sentence was almost over, Charles threw a party for his guards and fellow inmates. He drugged everyone with sleeping pills so that he could walk out of the prison, knowing he would immediately be arrested again. This was an intentional ploy to extend his sentence and avoid extradition to Vietnam until the statute of limitations ran out, as in Vietnam, he would have faced the death penalty. After his extended sentence in India, Charles was allowed to return to France, though he was later charged with murder in Nepal and sentenced to life in prison. He is confirmed to have murdered 12 tourists between 1975 and 1976, though the actual number is believed to be as high as 30. Also known as Metal Fan, Nikolai Dzhumagaliev was a serial killer cannibal born in Kazakhstan when it was a part of the USSR. After failed attempts at other careers, Nikolai moved to Unyagash in southern Kazakhstan to become a firefighter when he was 25. 2 years later, he committed his first murder, which he had very carefully planned out. His first victim was a woman walking alone down a rural road. Her body was discovered on the side of the road, but the investigation went nowhere. Nikolai committed 5 more murders that year, one of which resulted in his arrest. He had gotten extraordinarily drunk and accidentally shot a fellow firefighter. While this did lead to his arrest, he was sent to a psychiatric hospital and diagnosed with schizophrenia. Less than a year later, he was released again, and he immediately got back to the business of murdering. In December of 1980, Nikolai invited a number of his friends to his house. While everyone was enjoying the evening, Nikolai lured one of his guests into the next room and murdered him. Eventually, the other guests wondered where their friend had disappeared to and went to look for him, and they found Nikolai drenched in blood, cannibalizing the body. They fled the house and called the police, who entered to discover Nikolai still on his knees eating the victim. The police were so shocked to witness this that Nikolai actually had time to escape, fleeing his house and running to the mountains completely naked with nothing on him except for a hatchet. He was tracked down and arrested the next day. Because he had already been diagnosed with schizophrenia, Nikolai was sent to a psychiatric facility rather than an ordinary prison. He stayed there for 8 years before escaping and hiding from the police for 2. After those 2 years on the run, Nikolai decided to turn himself in by way of deliberately letting himself get caught for a lesser crime, in this case theft, and attempting to lie about his identity. Though the plan succeeded originally, he was eventually recognized as the cannibal murderer. As it turns out, that's not the sort of person that investigators just forget. He was later convicted of a 10th murder from 1990 following his escape, but it's believed that he had other victims while fleeing from the police as well. Moses Sittol became known as the South African Strangler and the ABC Killer, the latter because his murders took place in the South African cities of Atteridgeville, Boksburg, and Cleveland. When Moses was 5 years old, his father died, and his mother abandoned him and his 3 siblings. They were taken to an orphanage where Moses claimed they were mistreated, and when he was a teenager, he was convicted of sexual assault. After 7 years in prison, Moses was released. To most people, he seemed like an ordinary and laid-back guy, though his entire career was actually a lie. He was the manager of Youth Against Human Abuse, a charitable organization that claimed to be dedicated to ending child abuse. In reality, this was just a shell company, and it's unclear what responsibilities Moses had within the company, if any. But this fake charity was also the key to Moses' murders. He would post job openings, then take female applicants to remote fields for the alleged purpose of a job interview. Once there, Moses would beat and sexually assault his victims before murdering them by strangling them with their own underwear. In the span of just 16 months, he murdered at least 37 women and 1 child. The child was a 2-year-old that had been brought by his mother to the job interview. Moses hit the boy in the head, then after finishing off his mother, left the child to die of exposure. Once he became a suspect, Moses called a journalist to confess, giving the locations of one of his victims' bodies as a way to prove that he was the real killer. Claimed that the murders were being carried out as a form of revenge for what he felt were his years of false imprisonment. Moses added that all of his victims looked like the woman who he claimed lied about being sexually assaulted by him. Although he was believed to have murdered 76 people in that 16-month span, Moses was only convicted of 38 murders. For his crimes, he was sentenced to 2,410 years in prison with no possibility of parole until it served at least 930 years of that, so no parole. Ahmad Suradji was a cattle breeder and shaman living in Medan, the capital of North Sumatra in Indonesia. He seems to have lived an ordinary life until the age of 39, when he claimed his father visited him in a dream. According to Ahmed, his father told him that he had to drink the saliva of 72 dead women in order to gain supernatural powers and become a mystic healer. Although he admitted that his father's ghost did not specifically tell him to murder people, he felt that randomly stumbling across so many dead women would take entirely too long, and so he decided to speed up the process by killing them himself. Each victim was buried up to her waist in a sugarcane field before being strangled to death. It was easy for Ahmed to find victims, as his reputation as a shaman often caused women to come to his home seeking guidance. From 1986 until 1997, Ahmed murdered dozens of these women as part of his black magic ritual. In 1997, 21-year-old Shri Kamala Dewey took a rickshaw to Ahmed's home. Her body was found decomposing in a sugarcane field 3 days later, so the rickshaw driver told the police where he had dropped her off. Ahmed denied any involvement in the murder, though police found her belongings, such as a purse and jewelry, in his house. He was arrested and eventually confessed to having murdered 42 women, all of whose remains were found when excavating the sugarcane field. Ahmed was found guilty of murder at trial, and the audience cheered when the panel of judges announced that he was to be sentenced to death. The English word thug comes from the Hindi word thag, meaning rogue, thief, or cheat. In the 18th and 19th century in India, thuggy cults were organized groups of thieves and murderers similar to the mafia, but more nomadic. The leader of one of these thuggy cults was Thug Behram, also known as the King of the Thugs. He is considered to be one of history's most prolific serial killers, famous for strangling people to death. From 1790 through 1840, Thug is believed to have murdered as many as 931 people with his own hands. While their number may seem seem exceptionally high, he only had 125 confirmed victims. According to a contemporary source, Thug was quoted as saying that he was present for 931 murders, but that he only personally carried out 125 of them. But even if he didn't personally strangle each and every victim himself, as the leader of the Thuggee cult, he would have still borne the responsibility for the other murders, likely carried out under his orders. Though many of the serial killers that we've talked about thus far had pretty normal early lives, we tend to think of serial killers as often having traumatizing childhoods. Such was the case with Wang Qiang, whose father was a physically and emotionally abusive alcoholic. Wang's father didn't allow him to go to school, so by the age of 15, he was homeless and begging on the streets after having fled from his father's home. One day, Wang was surrounded by a group of other beggars who attacked him and beat him within inches of his life. After he recovered from his injuries, he was released, and an older man took Wang into his home and gave him a meal and a bed while explaining that Wang would never get anywhere in life by begging. According to the old man, the only way you could get ahead was by stealing. Rather than going back to the streets to beg, Wang began pickpocketing, with most of his money being taken by the old man as rent. A year after this began, Wang was arrested and sentenced to 2 years at a labor camp. In January 1995, shortly after his 20th birthday, Wang began murdering people in public parks. Working with a group of accomplices, they would ambush and kill their male victims, while female victims were robbed, sexually assaulted, and murdered, with the sexual assaults often taking place after the victims were already dead. Some of Wang's accomplices were arrested in 2003, and they wound up implicating Wang in the murders. He was arrested and interrogated for a year and a half, which admittedly sounds more like extended torture rather than interrogation, but he eventually confessed. In 2005, he was convicted of 45 counts of murder, though he is believed to have killed more than that, and he was executed later that year. Jane Toppin, born Honora Kelly in 1854, had a rough childhood. Her mother died when she was very young, and her father, another abusive alcoholic, gave 6-year-old Honora and her oldest sister to an orphanage. 2 years later, Honora was placed in the home of Anne C. Toppin of Lowell, Massachusetts, as an indentured servant. Wanting to distance herself from her father, the well-known crackpot and drunk, Honora changed her name to Jane Toppin. In 1885, at the age of 31, Jane went to Cambridge Hospital to study to be a nurse. She was always cheerful and friendly, so she earned the nickname of Jolly Jane. However, Jane didn't want to be a nurse, or at least she didn't want to be a nurse for the purpose of helping people, but rather as a means to an end. Jane's real goal was to murder more people than any man or woman who had ever lived. While training as a nurse, Jane would experiment on her elderly patients to see how their bodies reacted to varying doses of morphine and atropine. She would fake patients' charts while administering lethal doses of chemicals to them. She was then recommended for a position at Massachusetts General Hospital, where she continued murdering patients. Though she was not suspected of deliberately harming anyone, Jane was fired the year after because she recklessly administered opiates. After being fired from Mass General, Jane began working as a private nurse and poisoning people who were entirely too close to her if she ever wanted to get away with any of this. In 1895, she murdered her landlord and his wife, and in 1899, she murdered her foster sister. Somehow, none of this was deemed suspicious, perhaps because nobody thought there was any reason to check for poison. In 1901, Jane moved in with an elderly man, Alden Davis, to take care of him after his wife's death. When Alden invited Jane to come stay in his home and take care of him, he was unaware that she was the one that had murdered his wife. Within weeks, Jane had murdered Alden, his sister, and 2 of his daughters. Alden's remaining family demanded a toxicology exam to be performed on Alden's daughter, Minnie. She'd only been 40 years old and was in good health. Authorities determined that she had been poisoned, and Jane was arrested for murder. She confessed to 31 murders and is suspected of killing over 100 patients, but only 12 were ever proven. Despite Jane's best efforts to insist that she was sane and that she knew what she was doing was wrong, as a guilty verdict came with the chance of eventually being released, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity and spent the rest of her life in a mental hospital. Anatoly Onoprienko was a Soviet serial killer from Ukraine who held a virtual monopoly on cool serial killer names. He was known as the Beast of Ukraine, the Terminator, and Citizen O. Anatoly's mother died when he was just 4, so his father sent the boy to live with his grandparents and aunt, though they eventually gave him to an orphanage. Anatoly resented that he was given to an orphanage while his older brother got to continue living with their father, and he claimed that this destined him to become a criminal, as 70% of those who are raised in orphanages wind up in prison as adults. According to research from 2011, the number Anatoly quoted appears to be accurate. His first murders took place in 1989 during a burglary gone wrong. He and an accomplice entered a family home with 2 parents and their 8 children, intending to rob the place. They'd brought weapons with them for self-defense and wound up murdering all 10 people in the house. Later that year, Anatoly attempted to rob a car in which 5 people were sleeping, but again, things went wrong and he murdered all 5 people, including an 11-year-old child. There was then a break for 6 years before Anatoly decided to start intentionally killing people. For 4 months, beginning in December of 1995, he killed 37 more people. Each time Anatoly went out to kill, he murdered an entire family, with a few of his victims being people he thought might have been witnesses to his crimes. After killing the family and any witnesses, he would then burn their house down to hide any evidence. A massive manhunt ensued, searching for the murderer, though the first person police arrested in connection with the murders was the wrong suspect. That suspect was tortured to death, but less than 3 weeks later, Anatoly was caught. He had moved in with a relative, but the relative found his hidden cache of weapons and asked Anatoly to move out before informing the police. He was located and arrested a few days later. Anatoly confessed to 52 murders and was sentenced to death, but this was commuted to life in prison when Ukraine joined the Council of Europe, a requirement of which was to suspend capital punishment. Though seldom talked about today, Earle Nelson was the first American serial killer to receive national media attention. Both of Earle's parents died of syphilis before he was even 2 years old, so he was sent to live with his grandmother and her 2 younger children. Right from the start, Earle was a weird kid. He was described as exhibiting morbid behavior at a young age, and his behavior became so problematic that he was expelled from school when he was only 7. His behavior only got worse 3 years later, when he was riding his bike one day and collided with a streetcar. The head injury left him unconscious for 6 days, and when he finally woke up, his behavior was erratic and he was prone to memory loss. Earle began a life of crime at the age of 18, though his first crime was relatively harmless. He broke into a cabin that he mistakenly thought had been abandoned rather than just momentarily unoccupied. He was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but paroled after 1. However, just months later, he was arrested again for petty larceny. After jail, Earle found himself in and out of mental hospitals. A psychologist believed that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, but also felt that he was harmless. He did not appear to be violent, homicidal, or destructive, and was not thought to be a threat. Earle began his killing spree in 1926, and over the next 15 months, he would murder at least 22 women. For most of the murders, he would search ads in local newspapers looking for rooms for rent. Posing as a polite nomadic Christian, he would meet with the landlady to inquire about the room. Once inside, he'd strangle his victims to death and often sexually assault the bodies afterward. Then he would hide the body under the nearest bed. The media dubbed him the gorilla killer because the bodies appeared to have been strangled by someone with unusually long arms and massive hands. He traveled across the United States, committing murders from coast to coast before traveling to Canada to continue killing. However, because he was frequently seen by others while inquiring about rooms for rent, authorities were able to put together an accurate description of the suspect. He was eventually apprehended at a border crossing between the US and Canada. Earle was wanted for murder in 6 cities across the United States, but he was never extradited. Instead, for the murders he committed in Canada, he was sentenced to death by hanging. It's been 150 years since his conviction, but Jesse Pomeroy still holds the dubious distinction of being the youngest person in Massachusetts to ever be convicted of first-degree murder. It began in 1872, when young children were being mysteriously assaulted and abandoned around Chelsea, Massachusetts. A few months later, Jesse Pomeroy's family moved from Chelsea to South Boston, and the assaults moved with them. Victims ranged in age from 5 to 8 years old, with some of them being not just beaten, but stabbed as well. The Boston Globe reported on the fiendish boy who had caused public outrage by violently assaulting younger children, though the identity of the boy remained unknown. One day, Jesse was walking past the South Boston police station and decided to peek in the window. Inside was one of his recent victims, who noticed Jesse peering in, and the victim immediately pointed him out to police. Jesse was arrested and sentenced to 6 years at a reform school, though was paroled and sent back to live with his mother after little more than a year. A month later, 10-year-old Katie Curran went missing, and a month after that, the body of 4-year-old Horace Miller was found dead in a marsh. There was no evidence and nothing to implicate Jesse, but he immediately fell under police suspicion for obvious reasons. A search of Jesse's mother's house revealed the body of Katie Curran carelessly hidden in the basement in a pile of ash. Just 14 years old, Jesse was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Shortly after his 15th birthday, Jesse was convicted, with the jury recommending leniency in light of the boy's young age. Similarly, Jesse's attorney filed 2 exceptions, seeking to compel the judge to deviate from typical sentencing guidelines. The judge rejected all of this and sentenced Jesse to death. However, the governor of Massachusetts refused to sign that death warrant. In 1876, the death sentence was commuted to life in solitary confinement. After 41 years in solitary, Jesse's sentence was again commuted, this time allowing him to live with the rest of the prison population. When Jesse was 69 years old, 54 years after first being imprisoned, he was transferred to a hospital for the criminally insane, where he died 3 years later. Although only convicted of 2 murders, Jesse is believed to have had 7 other victims. Gustavo Romero Tercero may not have been prolific, but his crimes, they were particularly brutal. He was from Valdepeñas in Spain, and he married his first wife, Yolanda, at a young age. By the time he was 21, Yolanda was already pregnant with their second child. Although he was considered by others to be friendly and harmless, Gustavo was frequently violent with his wife and children. He also enjoyed voyeurism and would spy on couples making out in the park without being particularly concerned whether they saw him or not. In 1993, when Yolanda was still pregnant, Gustavo went to the park for a bit of perving on couples. He followed 24-year-old Angel Ibanez and his 20-year-old girlfriend Sarah Daughter out of the park before pulling a knife on them. He held the blade to Angel's throat and demanded their money, which they gave him. Afterwards, Sarah, presumably in too much shock to think this through clearly, said that she recognized Gustavo because her brother worked for Gustavo's uncle. Realizing he could be turned in, Gustavo immediately began stabbing Angel in the chest, continuing to stab him after he was already dead. Sarah tried to run, but Gustavo caught up to her and stabbed her in the back of the neck, paralyzing her and causing her to fall to the ground. He then turned her over, molesting her and sexually assaulting her with his fist before stabbing her to death in the chest. Yolanda immediately suspected Gustavo of these murders, but she didn't alert authorities. A few years later, he became friends with Sarah's brothers and would constantly ask about the state of the investigation. In 1998, he took his third victim, a cyclist who he claimed to have hit with his car by accident. Fearing that reporting her death would tie him to the other murders, he decided to dump her bicycle and body in different wells in the countryside. He first discarded the bicycle, then he drove his victim to a well. He began sexually assaulting what he believed was a dead body, but she regained consciousness while it was happening. He then strangled her and threw her down a well. 5 years later, her body still hadn't been found. One night, Gustavo assaulted Yolanda, claiming he didn't care if she told people because he had already killed multiple people, so she informed the police. Once the third victim's body was found, DNA on that body was matched to Gustavo. He was convicted of murder and sentenced to 103 years in prison. Born in Brazil in 1988, Tiago Henrique Gomes de Rocha was raised by his mother and grandparents, as his father was not in the picture. He claimed to have been sexually assaulted by a neighbor when he was young, bullied by boys in school, and always rejected by girls. This built up a lot of anger in him, and by the time he was 21, he decided to take that anger out on other people. Tiago had just begun a new job as a security guard at a maternity hospital a few months before the murders began. He was shy and mild-mannered, and there was nothing about his behavior that would have caused his family, friends, co-workers, or girlfriend to suspect that he was hiding a dark side. Tiago began his murders in 2011, following a specific pattern. His victims were either gay men, sex workers, or homeless people. The gay men he strangled, the sex workers he stabbed, and the homeless people he shot. This continued for about a year until Tiago changed his MO. Starting in 2014, all of Tiago's victims were shot from the back of a motorcycle. He would drive up to them on his bike, yell "robbery," then shoot them without stealing anything. He was caught on CCTV cameras in the area of the crimes on numerous occasions, sometimes while holding a gun. However, because he was wearing a helmet and using stolen license plates, it was difficult to identify the actual killer. It wasn't until Tiago was arrested for driving with a fake license plate that he came under suspicion. A search of his house found multiple stolen license plates and a .38 revolver, the same type used in the murders. After being arrested and interrogated, Tiago confessed to 39 murders. He then tried to backtrack and lower the number to 29, though evidence linked him to at least 38 of the murders to which he originally confessed. As of 2016, he has been convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to 25 years in prison, though there were 24 charges of murder still pending. Very little is known about the Native American known as Cuejo. He was believed to be the son of a Mexican miner and a Native American woman born in approximately 1880. Little more than that is known about the man himself, and it's not even agreed upon what tribe his mother was from. But even in his own time, Quejo was more of a legend than a man. The first person he killed was his half-brother, Avote, though it wouldn't really be fair to call this murder. Avote had gone on a rampage and was wanted for murder. When there were Native American suspects in cases like these, the tribes were expected to turn that person in, dead or alive, or face retaliation from the American settlers. When Quejo returned to El Dorado with proof of his brother's death, he was hailed as a hero. This didn't last long. His first verified victim was a night watchman at the Goldbug mine. Quejo shot him in the head and stole his badge and food. He also killed a 100-year-old blind Native American man known as Canyon Charlie with a pickaxe to the head, again stealing his food. Before long, every murder and disappearance in the area was attributed to Quejo, regardless of whether or not he was actually involved. He had 13 confirmed victims and 24 alleged victims, but there were dozens, if not hundreds of others that people tied to his name. To the people of Nevada, Quejo was the boogeyman. Eventually, there was so much hysteria surrounding him that the reward for his capture reached $3,000 in 1919 money. But he was never captured. Borman spent decades searching for Nevada's first mass murderer, a man with a club foot that made his tracks particularly easy to identify. It wasn't until 1940 that Quejo's body was finally found by prospectors along the Colorado River. He had been hiding out in a cave with a tripwire alarm, and he appeared to have died of a rattlesnake bite. Evidence of some of his crimes were found in the cave, such as a badge from the Goldbug mine. But how many men Quejo actually murdered will never be known. Born in 1933, Donald Pee Wee Gaskins Jr. started his criminal career at a young age. In early adolescence, he was already part of a gang of delinquents who would go around committing burglaries, assaults, and gang sexual assaults. He was arrested at the age of 13 when a woman caught him breaking into her house, and he responded by taking an axe to her head, though fortunately she survived. After 5 years in reform school, Donald was released, and he spent the subsequent 17 years in and out of prison for assaulting and sexually assaulting young girls. During his first day in prison, Donald committed his first murder. He killed the biggest, most feared inmate in the prison, earning the respect of the other inmates and adding 3 years to his sentence. Over the next 7 years, Donald murdered at least 13 people, though there was no pattern to the method or motive. Some of his victims were stabbed, some were shot, some drowned, and some poisoned. And for each murder, he seemed to have a different justification. Although the victims were all being searched for as missing persons, police didn't know there was a serial killer on the loose. But when one of Donald's criminal associates got arrested, he decided to turn on Donald in an attempt to reduce his own sentence. After being pointed in Donald's direction, authorities searched his property and found 8 bodies buried in shallow graves. He was convicted on 1 count of murder and sentenced to death, but the death sentence was overturned. Rather than face a new trial and possibly another death sentence, Donald decided to plead guilty to 9 total murders. He was sentenced to 10 concurrent life sentences. However, a few years later, Donald killed one more time. There was a death row inmate who had been convicted of killing a husband and wife who owned a local store, and their son felt the appeals process was taking entirely too long. The son met with Donald and paid him $2,000 to kill the other inmate, which Donald did. Thanks to this additional murder, he was again sentenced to death and was executed in 1991. Little is known about the life of Shankariya. He was born in Jaipur, India in 1952, and there's no information from before his arrest. From 1973 through 1974, Shankariya killed 70 people with a hammer. The murders earned him the name Kampatimar, literally one who hits under the ear, because he struck his victims on the neck below the ears with that hammer. After striking his victims, Shankariya would often make himself at home, eating the victims' food, smoking, and bathing, while the victims, often still alive at this point, slowly succumbed to their injuries. Fingerprints found on a tin box at one of the crime scenes were able to link him to the murders, and he was arrested. After being interrogated, he confessed to 70 murders, claiming that he killed people for his own personal enjoyment. However, because the evidence in the case was limited and mostly circumstantial, he later attempted to retract his confession, claiming that it had been coerced. This tactic didn't work, and he was sentenced to death. While awaiting his execution, Shankariya finally repented and accepted responsibility for what he had done. His final words as he was being led to the gallows were, "I have murdered in vain. Nobody should become like me." Javed Iqbal grew up in Lahore, Pakistan in 1961. His father was a businessman, and at the age of 17, while still a student, Javed created his own steel recasting business. He had a single run-in with the law in the 1990s, but otherwise he seemed to be an upstanding citizen. Following his initial arrest, Javed's social and financial status quickly deteriorated given the nature of his crime, but nobody expected what would happen next. In December 1999, Javed sent a letter to the police confessing to the sexual assault and murder of over 100 boys aged 6 through 16, all occurring in 1998 to 1999. The victims were orphans and runaways who he sexually abused, strangled to death, and dismembered before dissolving their remains in vats of acid that he would later dump in a nearby river. Police searched Javed's house after receiving this letter, and they found carefully catalogued evidence of his crimes, including photographs of the victims' bodies, each labeled with their name and age. There were also 2 vats of acid containing human remains and plenty of other evidence. The letter also claims that Javed's motive for these murders was anger at the police. His original arrest was for sexual assault of a young boy, but that boy managed to severely bludgeon Javed in the head until he was unconscious, allowing him to escape. Javed lamented that his mother had to witness his life fall to hell until she died of a heart attack. He incorrectly believed that the boy should have faced charges for the beating that was clearly performed in self-defense, and so he decided to murder 100 boys so that their mothers would suffer and cry as his mother had. After a month on the run, Javed turned himself in to the newspaper The Daily Jang, stating that he chose to turn himself in there because he was afraid the police would kill him. He was subsequently arrested, convicted, and sentenced to death. The judge ruled, "You will be strangled to death in front of the parents whose children you killed. Your body will then be cut into 100 pieces and put in acid the same way you killed the children." The Interior Minister quickly overruled this particular form of execution as it was a violation of the Human Rights Commission, but the death sentence was upheld. Before he could be executed, Javed was found dead in his cell in 2001. It was officially ruled a suicide by hanging, even though an autopsy revealed that he had been severely beaten before being hanged. Oh no. Born in Colombia, Daniel Barbosa is another of the 10 most prolific serial killers of all time. However, he is often overlooked because he was active at the same time as an even more prolific murderer and fellow Colombian, Pedro Lopez. Though he had an arrest for petty theft, Daniel's serious crimes began when he was about 30 years old. He'd been living with his girlfriend, with whom he had 2 children, but he fell in love with someone else. Originally, he plans on marrying this other woman, but he broke things off when he found out that she wasn't a virgin. He then agreed to stay with his current girlfriend so long as she could provide him with young virgins to sexually assault. She would lure young girls to their house, then drug them so Daniel could assault them. They did this 5 times, but the 5th girl reported them to the police. Initially, Daniel was sentenced to 3 years in prison, and he was grateful for the leniency, promising to repent. When another judge upgraded the sentence to 8 years, Daniel became angry and decided to escalate his crimes instead. After being released, he began murdering his victims so that they could not go to the police as his previous victim had. He is believed to have murdered 80 girls in the year following his release, before being convicted of the murder of a 9-year-old girl and sentenced to 30 years in prison. Daniel then escaped prison and sailed to Ecuador, where he continued his crimes. In 1986, he was approached by a pair of beat cops who thought Daniel was acting suspicious. It turned out that this was mere minutes after his last murder, and he was carrying a bag with the bloody clothes and part of the genitalia of a 9-year-old victim. He was arrested, and after remorselessly confessing to having murdered 72 people in Ecuador, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. 5 years after he was sentenced, Daniel was stabbed to death by a fellow inmate and nephew of one of his previous victims. Daniel is believed to have killed as many as 180 girls. Florisvaldo de Oliveira was better known as Cabo Bruno, a name he received in his childhood after being compared to a local drunk named Bruno. He was born in Brazil in 1958 and had an ordinary childhood, eventually becoming a member of the military police in Sao Paulo. But Florisvaldo wasn't satisfied acting within the confines of the law. He wanted to clean up the streets by any means necessary, so in his spare time, he took to vigilante killings of known or suspected criminals. Of course, not all of his victims were necessarily guilty of anything. While his goal was to only murder criminals, he also killed anyone who he thought looked a bit like a criminal. For example, other members of the death squad he led stated that Florisvaldo might murder someone simply because they had a tattoo, because he assumed that anyone with a tattoo must be a criminal. Florisvaldo's death squad included other police officers, and for a while their actions were protected by the higher-ups in the police. In 1983, by which point there was simply too much evidence to ignore, he was arrested and charged with 20 counts of murder, though he is suspected of committing in excess of 50 murders. He only confessed to one of the murders, and other police officers tried to testify in his defense, but Florisvaldo was convicted of murder and sentenced to 113 years in prison. There were several escapes and escape attempts, but eventually Florisvaldo calmed down and became an evangelical pastor. He was paroled after 27 years in 2012 on good behavior. He would always walk around with a laminated copy of his official release papers, as well as a list of 10 things he hoped to accomplish before he died. But he didn't get the chance to. 1 month after being released from prison, Florisvaldo was gunned down while walking home from church with his family. Two men walked up to him and shot him 20 times without injuring anyone else or stealing anything, making it clear this was a retaliatory execution for all of his years doing extrajudicial murders. Radik Tagirov was born in the area that is now the Republic of Tatarstan in 1982, back when it was part of the USSR. He studied to become a locksmith, but work was difficult to find following the fall of the Soviet Union. Radik was arrested in 2009 for petty theft, which made further employment impossible. Instead, he became a homeless vagrant, doing whatever he thought he had to in order to survive. And in 2011, what he thought he had to do to survive was commit murder. Over the span of about 18 months, he murdered 31 women in the Volga and Ural districts of Russia, earning him the nickname the Volga Maniac. All of his victims were single or widowed elderly women aged 75 and up, all of whom lived in low-cost Soviet-era housing projects. Radik would pose as either a utility worker or employee of social services to gain access to the house, and once inside, he'd strangle his victims to death and rob them. Radik had 32 victims in total, only one of whom survived the attack. It was one of his earliest victims who survived, but she was blind, so had no way to identify him. A CCTV camera caught Radik entering one of the buildings in September 2012, but he wasn't found and arrested until December of 2020. He initially confessed to 25 of the murders, though he later recanted, claiming the confession was made under duress. Regardless, DNA evidence was able to tie him to the murders, and in 2024 he was sentenced to life in prison for 31 counts. No, not that Bruce Lee, although that is where the killer got his name. Peter George Dinsdale was born in Manchester, England in 1960, the son of a sex worker. When his mother married a man with the last name Lee in 1979, he legally changed his first name to Bruce, becoming Bruce George Peter Lee, both to take his stepfather's surname and as a homage to the famed actor and martial artist. Bruce suffered from multiple medical problems from an early age, including epilepsy and congenital spastic hemiplegia in his right limbs. The latter condition, which results in muscles being permanently contracted, caused Bruce to walk with a limp and frequently hold his right arm across his chest. In 1979, when Bruce was 19, a fire broke out in his neighborhood in the home of Edith Hasty. Her oldest son, Charles, managed to push her out of a window to safety, but he was unable to escape himself. 3 of her 4 sons died in that fire. Police began doing a routine investigation, and they were shocked at the neighborhood's total indifference to the deaths of 3 children. They discovered that the Hasties were a problem family known for petty crimes, and so they began searching for someone who might have committed arson as a vendetta. When questioned, Bruce eventually confessed to setting the fire, stating that he didn't mean to kill them. However, much to the shock of the police, he then confessed to setting 9 other fires over the past 7 years. Most of these fires were just random because he just loved fire, though 2 of the other fires had also been vendettas. Even though these fires claimed the lives of 26 people with victims as young as 6 months old, Bruce showed no remorse for their deaths, as murder hadn't been his goal, just arson. Though originally charged with 11 counts of arson and 26 counts of murder, Bruce pled the deaths down to manslaughter. His plea was accepted in the interest of saving the expenses of a trial, and he was sentenced to indefinite detention in a psychiatric hospital. Despite being responsible for more deaths than any other British killer at the time, Bruce's case received virtually no attention, both because he was able to plead to manslaughter instead of murder, and because the trial of the Yorkshire Ripper was going on at the exact same time. From a young age, Yvon Keller had to struggle to survive. His mother died when she was only 49, and his father worked in a potash mine in Alsace, France. The mining job wasn't enough to support Yvon and his 8 siblings, so Yvon was forced to work to help support his family. By the age of 17, he was already in trouble for stealing antiques defense. After 10 years in prison for the theft, Yvon seemed to be living a normal, quiet life. He got married and created his own landscaping company, though he later divorced and remarried. Everyone saw Yvon as a kind and helpful person, and he was seen as living a modest but happy life. However, his first wife told a different story. She said that Yvon had forced her into sex work because he needed money for gambling and to afford fancy hotels and restaurants. His love of money and luxury didn't end with his first marriage, and so Yvon turned instead to murder. His victims were all elderly women who were found dead in their homes. Yvon became known as the Pillow Killer because he suffocated his victims with pillows to make it appear as if they had died of natural causes. He would then rob the houses of any cash or valuables that he could sell. Many relatives of the victims did not believe that their loved ones had simply died of natural causes, all for the same reason. The bed was too well made. It was likely done to hide the signs of a struggle, but Yvon's elderly victims were old and frail, and many would have struggled to make up a bed as meticulously as he had done. Yvon was the subject of police's suspicions on multiple occasions from 1993 until 2003, but there was never enough evidence. His work as a landscaper provided him with an alibi for being seen at homes where murders were later committed, but in 2006, Yvon was eventually arrested in connection with the burglary. He was suspected of having killed 40 women, but he quickly confessed to 150. Only 23 murders have been conclusively linked to him thus far, but if his confession was accurate, it would make him the most prolific murderer in France's history. Yvon died in 2006 during his trial when he hanged himself in a courthouse holding cell. Marie Liddy was born in Philadelphia in 1928. She had difficulty in school, which she attributed to having contracted scarlet fever when she was 5 years old, and she dropped out when she was 12 years old to help raise her older sister's daughter. When she was 19, she met Arthur No at a private club in the West Kensington area of Philadelphia. The two quickly fell in love and eloped, planning to start a family. 9 months and 6 days after their wedding, their first child was born. Sadly, he died a month later. Over the next 20 years, the couple would have a total of 10 children. Their 6th child was stillborn, and the 8th died in hospital due to a congenital disorder, but the other 8 had all been born healthy and sent home with Marie and Arthur. None of them survived past 14 months, with one being found dead only 5 days after he was born. The deaths were all attributed to sudden infant death syndrome, and Life magazine even published a 1963 article about the sympathetic plight of this unlucky couple, written using pseudonyms. Decades later, however, these deaths would be revisited. A 1997 book about a similar case reignited interest in Marie's case, and the 1998 article Cradle to the Grave by Stephen Freed reopened the case into the deaths of her children. After Stephen turned everything he found over to the police, they went to question Marie. She admitted to suffocating 4 of her children, though she couldn't remember if or how she had killed the others. Marie was charged and pled guilty to 8 counts of second-degree murder. Because she was already in her 70s, her plea bargain only resulted in a sentence of 20 years probation, with the first 5 years under house arrest. In exchange for such leniency, she had to take part in psychiatric studies that would try to identify what causes women to kill their children. The case of Ramon Escobar is best known for reigniting debates over illegal immigration in the United States. Ramon was born in 1971 in El Salvador. In the 1980s, he illegally entered the US, but he was arrested and deported in 1988. He returned 4 years later, staying with family in Houston, Texas. A few years into his stay, he was arrested for burglary and assault, and Ramon was again deported to El Salvador. Over the coming decades, Ramon would re-enter the US and be deported many more times. Ramon returned to the US in 2017 after his 7th deportation, and he applied for political asylum. This was approved, and it granted him permanent residency, allowing him to stay with his aunt and uncle in Houston and to find work as a day laborer. He would occasionally try to supplement his income with petty theft, but managed to avoid jail time. Even though people knew Ramon was a petty criminal, nobody considered him to be dangerous. He had plenty of friends and was well liked by neighbors. Then, in August 2018, all of that changed. Ramon got into an argument with his uncle and beat him to death with a police baton. 2 days later, when his aunt was growing suspicious, he strangled her to death. Ramon hid the bodies in a dumpster, and their skeletal remains weren't found until months later in a landfill. When friends began wondering what happened to Ramon's aunt and uncle, he fled Texas and drove to California, where he lived in homeless communities. Just a week after moving to California, he began killing again. Over the coming 3 weeks, he killed more than 5 homeless men. Ramon was apprehended by police just minutes after his 7th murder and was arrested. Evidence was able to tie him to his 4 other murders, though he pled not guilty. A month after being formally charged, detectives from Houston came to interview him about his aunt and uncle. This time, Ramon confessed to the murders. In order to avoid the death penalty, Ramon agreed to plead guilty to all 7 counts of murder and serve multiple consecutive life sentences. He is suspected of committing an 8th murder while in prison, that of his cellmate, a convicted child predator. According to a note found in Ramon's cell, he strangled his cellmate to death on account of his poor hygiene. Before online dating apps, there were personal ads in newspapers. That is where Belle Gunness, born Brynhilde Paulsdatter Storseth, found most of her victims. Belle was born in Norway in 1859. As an adolescent, she worked milking and herding cattle so that she could save up enough money to travel to the United States. During the immigration process, she changed her name from Brynhilde to Belle because America. After moving to America, she went to live in Chicago with her older sister who had already immigrated years earlier. She first worked as a domestic domestic servant before getting a job as a butcher where she would cut up animal carcasses. At the age of 24, she married Mad Sorensen. The two owned a candy shop together, but both the shop and their house burned down. Both were insured, as were the lives of two babies who died in the blaze. This arose suspicion from neighbours, as at no point had Belle ever appeared to be pregnant. July the 30th, 1900 was a very special day for Belle's husband, Mads. He already had a life insurance policy, but had recently purchased a new one to replace it. The new policy was set to take effect the day before the old policy expired, which meant that July 30th was the singular day on which Mads was covered by both life insurance policies, and very coincidentally, that was the day that he died. What? Belle used her new windfall to purchase a pig farm in Indiana. She married Peter Gosness, and a week later, his infant daughter died. 8 months later, Peter died from a severe skull injury, which Belle claimed happened when a meat grinder fell off a shelf onto his head. She collected another insurance policy on his life. Afterwards, Belle began placing personal ads in newspapers, seeking a husband. She invited men to come visit her on her farm, all of whom she robbed and murdered. When the relative of one of her victims wrote to Belle saying that he was going to come and visit and ask questions, Belle's farm mysteriously burned down. Belle's 3 children and a headless woman were found in the remains of the farm, and originally stories ran of the poor woman who died trying to save her children. Then authorities found all the bodies buried on her property, and coverage about the story suddenly changed. Instead of a sympathetic and heroic figure, the media instead referred to her as Hell's Belle, a brutal murderer who used her skills as a butcher to dismember bodies and bury them in the ground. Belle is confirmed to have killed 14 people, though she is suspected of killing at least 40. It's also unknown what happened to her, as the headless body found after the fire was deemed by the coroner to be 5 inches too short and 50 pounds too light to have been Belle. There is little known about Abdul Jabbar, the most prolific serial killer in Afghanistan's history. It's believed that he grew up in poverty, though where and when he was born is unknown. Throughout the 1960s and into the 1970s, he brutally murdered at least 65 men and boys. Abdul would lure his victims into a secluded area before strangling them to death with a turban whilst in the act of sexually assaulting them, earning him the name the Turban Strangler. There was so much fear over the deranged killer and so much pressure on authorities to bring him to justice that 2 different men were falsely convicted and executed for Abdul's crimes. In 1970, police caught Abdul in the act of assaulting and strangling his next victim. He was arrested and quickly sentenced to death. Although it's only confirmed that he killed 65 people, he's believed to have killed over 300. Fernando Hern&aacute, also known by his alias Pancho Lopez, might be the most prolific serial killer in Mexican history, and yet there's almost no reporting about him. Fernando was born in 1964, and by 1982, at the age of 18, he was already wanted for dozens of murders. He was arrested in 1982, but he managed to escape. Fernando was arrested again in 1986 and convicted of 33 counts of murder, but he again escaped, spending 13 years on the run. It wasn't until 1999 that Fernando was captured for good. A police press conference was held when Fernando was arrested, and for some reason, he was allowed to speak at the conference as well. He confessed on live television to murdering around 100 people and kidnapping 6 others. When asked by a reporter why he did it, Fernando replied, "I killed them all because I had to. I don't know how to do anything else." The public was skeptical of what sounded like a ridiculous claim, especially since he had only been convicted of 33 murders, but as time went on, more and more evidence was uncovered to corroborate his claim. In fact, it is now believed that Fernando underestimated his number of victims and that he killed 137 people or more. Rather than trying to escape police custody again, Fernando instead attempted to end his own life in jail, but he was far too fat now. The improvised rope he made was unable to support his body weight of over 300 pounds, and he fell to the floor, sustaining minor injuries. He's currently serving a 60-year prison sentence. Sergei Ryakhovsky was born in Soviet Russia in 1952. He served in the Soviet army and later claimed to neighbors that he was a veteran of the Soviet-Afghan War, though the known timeline of his life makes this claim unlikely. After his time in the army, Sergei became a police investigator, and he was quite good at the job. Also, it appeared, so he was recommended for the Ministry of Internal Affairs. However, he was caught falsifying evidence, so he was forced to resign. He worked a number of different odd jobs before moving to Ukraine in 1982 and again getting a job as a police investigator. Beginning in 1984, Sergei began murdering girls in his jurisdiction and in the neighboring provinces. He would find girls between the ages of 8 and 18, sexually assault them, suffocate them to death, and then sexually assault them again. He would then use his knowledge as an investigator to stage the scene and throw police off his tracks. This continued for 21 years, during which time 15 other men were falsely convicted of different murders committed by Sergei. He was caught in August of 2005 when he attended the funeral of one of his victims. Other children at the funeral recognized Sergei as having been with the victim shortly before her death. He was arrested later that month and confessed to killing over 100 girls over the previous decades, demanding to be given the death penalty. Although police couldn't prove he killed 100 people, he was charged and convicted of 37 counts of murder and sentenced to life in prison. While in prison, Sergei was able to marry and conceive a child with a woman in her 20s who read about his crimes and was just a really big fan. Only one thing is known about Paul Rung's childhood. That's that he showed signs of sexual sadism from a disturbingly young age. Paul's mother died when he was 17, at which point Paul decided to act on his sadistic urges. He beat up and sexually assaulted a 14-year-old girl, though he turned himself into the police afterwards. Paul was sentenced to 14 years, but he was released in 1994 at the age of 24, serving only half his sentence. After prison, he got married and got a job first as a shoe salesman and then as a truck driver. While he seemed to be living an ordinary life, his crimes had resumed the year after his release. His first victim was 25-year-old Stacy Frobel, a friend of his wife. Stacy had come to visit his wife, but never returned home. 2 weeks later, Stacy's dog came home with her severed leg in his mouth. 5 days later, the dog found her other leg. The FBI immediately had Paul as their prime suspect. He had a history of violence. Stacy's last known whereabouts were his house, and he called in sick to his job at the shoe store for several days after her disappearance, just before quitting entirely. Paul and his wife were under heavy surveillance for the next 2 years, though it didn't stop Paul from killing. Like some other killers we've discussed today, Paul would search for ads of houses for sale or rent, then pose as someone interested in the house. Once inside, he would sexually assault and murder the owner. Sometimes he dismembered and disposed of the bodies, other times he burned the houses down to try and hide the evidence. In 1997, Paul was arrested for violating his parole by possessing a weapon. He was held in custody for 2 years before finally confessing to the 7 murders for which he was being investigated. In his first trial, he was convicted of 2 murders and sentenced to death, so the state decided not to continue pursuing the other cases, viewing it as a waste of state time and money. The sentence was commuted to life in prison once Illinois abolished the death penalty. In June of 1983, Robert Hansen offered 17-year-old Cindy Paulson $200 to perform oral sex. Once she got in his car, he pulled out a gun, drove her to his home on the east side of Anchorage, Alaska. He sexually assaulted and tortured her before chaining her up and taking a nap. Once he woke up, he said that he was going to take her to his cabin. Cindy was handcuffed in the backseat of the car while Robert drove to the airport, as his cabin was only accessible by plane or boat. Once they arrived at the airfield, Cindy realized she could make a break for it. While Robert was distracted loading the plane, she jumped out of the backseat and fled to the nearest road, where she was picked up by a passing motorist. Cindy also left her shoes in the backseat of Robert's car to prove that she had been there. Robert was questioned by police, but said that she had tried to extort him and that she was trying to get him in trouble because he refused to pay. Because he was a quiet and polite man who worked as a simple baker, police let him go and didn't consider him a serious suspect. Also, Robert's friends had provided him with an alibi. It was 4 more months and involvement from the FBI before Robert was arrested again, at which point authorities discovered that he may have murdered at least 37 women between the ages of 16 and 41 over the previous 12 years, a dozen more murders than he was already suspected of at the time of his arrest. Robert would target women, often sex workers, and bring them to his house and torture and sexually assault them. Afterwards, he would take them to remote locations such as his cabin and release them so that he could hunt them for sport. Because of his brutal murders and his occupation, Robert became known as the Butcher Baker. Although he is only confirmed to have murdered 17 women, the murder map found in his house detailed 37 grave sites. Some matched locations where police had already found bodies, while others were previously unknown to police and also contained human remains, leading investigators to believe the count of 37 is accurate. Mariam Souliotis was an abbess with an offshoot of the Greek Orthodox Church. She established her monastery in the mountains of East Attica, Greece, along with Archbishop Matthew Karpathakis of Vresthina, the leader of their religious sect. Aside from doing the typical clergy stuff, the monastery was also meant to provide free treatment for tuberculosis patients. In a manner of speaking, they didn't offer any actual medical services, but the high-altitude air of the mountains was believed to have health benefits. Archbishop Matthew had been in charge of the monastery, but his health began to decline in 1939, at which point Mariam took over the responsibilities of an abbess. One of those responsibilities involved acquiring funding to keep the monastery running. To do this, Mariam would try and get wealthy women to join the convent. After they joined, Mariam would torture them until they signed over all of their property to the monastery. Once the documents were official, she would murder them and embezzle much of the funds from the monastery for her own personal gain. The monastery was raided by the police in December of 1950. There were already allegations against the monastery, as families of some of the donors felt that the women would never have willed their entire fortunes to a monastery unless forced to do so by means such as torture. However, the raid was carried out to investigate completely unrelated crimes, illegal export of olive oil, and the illegal import of tires. This was the public justification, at least, as those crimes were believed to be taking place as well, though the police were quite interested in investigating the claims of murder. It's believed that Mariam murdered 27 women, though she died before her trial was complete, so she was only convicted of 7 premeditated murders. But there was all of the negligent homicide as well. Those that Mariam enticed to the mountains with promises of tuberculosis treatment died of their illness in the monastery, a predictable outcome as they weren't actually attempting to treat the patients in any way. If we include the cases of negligent homicide as well, then Mariam is believed to be responsible for the deaths of 177 people. And that's all 50. Thank you for watching.